بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على مبعوث رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين اللهم ألهمنا رشدنا وفقنا بما تحب الله. Okay, brothers and sisters, so we're continuing off of our last lecture on the subject matter, a very important subject matter, as many of us can understand. We are currently dealing with a crisis around the world, within the United States, abroad, regardless of religion, regardless of race, regardless of nation. As a result, we've been talking about an interesting subject revolving around disease and plague in the Islamic thought and Islamic theory. The last lecture, we talked about the adab, the mannerisms that are requested and upright for a person who is afflicted by disease, who is afflicted by a plague, who is afflicted by such things. We talked about important supplications first and foremost, and this isn't necessarily in order. We hope that we can apply these simultaneously. We talked about supplications, forms of supplications and prayers to God. We talked about the form of patience, ala qada Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, patience when dealing with the predicament that we are in. We talked about specifics and advised with regard to specifics. So as such, what we do today, God willing, for our subject matter and discussion, is we will continue off of that and we will talk about the adab, the manners, dealing again with the afflictions that we are dealing with and building off of it again. We ask the Almighty for help and support and intellect and wisdom. Wallahu waliyu tawfiq subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we reached element number 3. We said the first element would be, when talking about adab, mannerisms when dealing with the affliction, would be forms of supplications and prayers. And in those forms, al-afiyah, we talked about al-isti'adha, praying to the Almighty for physical and spiritual well-being and seeking protection through your prayers and supplications of the Almighty with the sickness at hand. Just remember something, this does not nullify the idea of seeking remedies, but this is something that initially we step forth with, and while doing so, we do our parts through causation that surrounds us. Number 2 was the patience when dealing with that particular affliction, understanding that in traditional Islamic theology, there is something known as divine destiny. And this afflicts everyone and it surrounds everyone. As such, we now talk about what to do when you're in this type of particular predicament: supplications, patience, and now an intellectual thought that is connected to spirituality. And that is something known in Islamic spiritualism as husnul dhan billah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Husnul dhan is that a person has a positive, well thought, goodness, nobility in and with and according to the Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala's lofty position. And this is reflected when we say husnul dhan billah subhanahu wa ta'ala, having optimistic thought, optimistic faith, optimistic spirituality, optimism towards the Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this particular point is very much important because sometimes when we deal with difficulty, for some people, it causes tremendous shake in their faith, right? They start to question God and they start to say, why God, why have you forsaken me? Or is there a God? How could God allow this? Is there even a God? Etc. They're in a state of difficulty. So in this state of difficulty, for these individuals, their anger overlaps their connection with the Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala. The difficulty they're facing with overlaps the particular mannerisms that are directly relevant to the circumstance. So what's important to remember is when you face difficulty, and in this case, disease, reflection or negation or reduction in a person's health, that alone does not mean the Almighty is angry with you. That alone does not mean the Almighty has forsaken you. Let's talk a little bit more about husn al-dhann billah and some of its characteristics here. Optimism towards the Almighty, optimism with the circumstance, optimism with the future and for the future, and optimism sooner or later when we meet the Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala. So husn al-dhann, this characteristic known as husn al-dhann, it has particulars, and these particulars are very much manifested through manners, and it is manifested through knowledge, and it is also manifested, believe it or not, through faith. So when we think of this disease, undoubtedly it is causing difficulty on a person's life. You could have cancer, you could be afflicted by coronavirus, you could be afflicted by outside forms of difficulty that isn't necessarily a form of a sickness, but a form of a lack in wealth, a difficult circumstance, whatever it is. Just remember point number one when we think of husn al-dhann billah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that difficulty, that sickness, that disease, that hardship, in comparison to the Almighty's ability, the Almighty's will, the Almighty's intervention, is insignificant. It is very insignificant. As a result, you find in a number of references in the Quran, things to ponder over, to realize that in the end, though we see things so great and so large through God, through approaching God, things that seem very large actually become small. Right? مثليهم رأي العين والله يؤيد بنصره من يشاء. So number one is to hold fast to the idea and concept and faith that the Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala's ability is far greater than the difficulty you are facing, the disease you face, the sickness, the hardship, the circumstance of wealth. The Almighty's ability is far greater, more capable. Number two, when we think of these difficulties, we tend to think of wrath, right? We tend to think of anger. But this shouldn't be the automatic thought for a mu'min. In Islamic theology, it's actually the contrary. One of the things that are very important to remember when you are in this particular case, which is a characteristic of this concept in Islamic theology known as husn al-dhann billah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is that the mercy of the Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala, His mercy is tremendously larger than the difficulty and the fear and the hardship that you are facing at hand. Number one was realizing that the ability of the Almighty is far greater, unimaginably, incomparably, than the hardship you face. Number two is to realize that the mercy of the Almighty, subhanahu wa ta'ala, His mercy, His grace, similarly, incomparably, is far greater, far larger, far more unique, far more special, far more able than the fear, the difficulty, and or the sickness that you face. Number three, from the characteristics of husn al-dhann billah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when you are afflicted with a hardship, if it be disease or virus or anything else, remember something, that the Almighty does not need, nor does He benefit from punishing a person. And that's a very profound statement. And that is the characteristics of Islamic theologians of old, the Islamic philosophy and theology on this concept. The Almighty, He doesn't need to punish a person. In the state of hardship, in the state of difficulty, the Almighty doesn't benefit by punishing somebody. And I think many of us who have studied the prophetic traditions or basic Quranic verses would and will recollect a number of references behind that. La yanfa, the Almighty is not going to benefit through the punishment of the person. So Al-Hafidh ibn Hajar Asqalani, he says that. He says God does not need, nor does he benefit from punishing a person. Number 4, from the characteristics of husn al-dhann billah, when a person is afflicted with a difficulty, is an interesting one. And that is to acknowledge one's mistakes and shortcomings. To acknowledge it, to realize it. So your weakness, you are in need. You may have, in the past, committed mistakes. You are in need. That's number 1. Number 2 is possible in the past, you may have, everyone makes mistakes, and it is a characteristic of the human being, fall into a mistake deliberately. Okay, and you may have had shortcomings, and everyone has these lapses. But the interesting thing about these particular circumstances and the characteristic of husn al-dhann billah subhanahu wa ta'ala is when you're in this state, you start to realize that you're actually quite vulnerable. You are actually quite limited. You are actually quite humbled and not as great as you imagined. But you are in need. So when you are in need, you look for help. And that's actually a manifestation of a person's faith. So when you're in hardship and you start to look to the Almighty and you humble yourself and you say, I can't do anything. This is it now. I am in your hands. Please help me. Inni maghlubun fantasir. Help me. I'm in a circumstance that's extremely difficult, for example. Then you'll start to think of things you may have not thought of beforehand, such as appreciation or the bounties that you have had around you, as the Prophet, he said, إِن كَانَ خَيْرًا لَهُ شَكَرَ فَكَانَ خَيْرًا لَهُ. If the person is found of goodness and bounty in their life and they are grateful to the Almighty, then it becomes good for them, especially in the spiritual sense, though it has its effects in the material itself. And similarly, if they are in a difficulty, but they are patient, فَصَبَرَ فَكَانَ خَيْرًا لَهُ. They are patient in this difficulty, then that particular patience and circumstance actually is good for them. So in this light of husn al-dhann billah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what happens is, in this humility, you start to acknowledge the mistakes you've made in the past. Sooner or later, in your thoughts, when you're alone in bed, when you are alone or you're in pain, oh help me, etc., or moments of peace, alhamdulillah, what was that? These type of moments, and that moment where your heart changes and those supplications are tremendously profound in the sight of the Almighty. So with that in mind, it's important to recognize as well that we are humbled, and in a humbled state, as is well known in Islamic theology and its teachings, a humbled you is the best you who has ever existed. Number 5, to ponder, to seek, and to review the Quranic narrative and the prophetic traditions connected to something known as al-raja. And this word, al-raja, is that one has wishful, optimistic, wishful thinking. Okay? So what does that mean? It means that there is hope. So it is a hopeful form of wishful thinking. And in this hope, what is it that we mean? We said husn al-dhann billah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from its characteristic is there is hope. There is always hope with God, the Almighty. And that's the beautiful thing of prayers. For a person who believes in miracles, who believes in prayers, there is always hope, regardless of whatever is faced, whatever circumstance befalls a person. So al-raja is another very important statement to hold fast to in these type of circumstances. What is al-raja? What are some of its characteristics? It's being patient. So you are patient with your optimistic, hopeful belief and thought process. And in this case, husn al-dhann, towards the Almighty especially. Number 2 is that in your prayers itself, so being patient, now in your supplications itself, being wishful, being hopeful, and understanding that miracles is all capable in the hands of the Almighty. Nothing is limited in the hands of the Almighty. Number 3 is that if it so happens from this characteristic of al-raja, beneath the umbrella of husn al-dhan that we are talking about here, if it so happens that in this affliction you pass, in this raja, what it is you have hopeful thinking, optimistic thought, and prayers that you will have a passing which is husna. It is known as a husna. It is a good spiritual state that you are in if you so come to a particular circumstance that you are in. So some hadith revolving around this particular subject that we have talked about for today. We talked about husn al-dhan billah being a characteristic of the adab, mannerisms, when dealing with a circumstance for which one is afflicted with disease, for example, in our current times, or whatever it may be. We said the third point is husn al-dhan billah, and it has characteristics. And from among its characteristics is the concept of al-raja, which is wishful, optimistic, hopeful thinking and belief in the Almighty. What are some prophetic traditions that provide examples of the things we talked about beneath the umbrella of husn al-dhan billah? If we said, for example, the Almighty's ability is far greater than the difficulty you face, to believe that is part of the characteristic of husn al-dhan, or to recognize and believe that the mercy of the Almighty is far greater than the hardship you're going through. What are some prophetic traditions that surround and revolve around the concept of husn al-dhan billah subhanahu wa ta'ala? This particular tradition here can be argued to be one of the greatest prophetic traditions that are established, that essentially describes a relationship between the human being and the Almighty, a relationship between the two. And this is one of the highest level of forms of husn al-dhan. So always having optimistic, hopeful, proper, good thoughts and belief towards the Almighty. And one of those examples is a prophetic tradition of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that Shaddad ibn Aus radiallahu anh, he said that the Prophet ﷺ described a supplication, and it is considered the forerunner of forms of supplication, and it comes in the form of supplication that is a representation acknowledging your mistakes, your limitations, the hardships that you are in, and the characteristic of God's mercy, and the characteristic of God's ability, and the characteristic that the Almighty is always able, and hope is always there. It is known as Sayyidul Istighfar. It is that the Prophet, he said, أن يقول العبد اللهم أنت ربي, that a person in their supplication, in their belief, they acknowledge that, O Almighty, you are my Lord. This monotheistic God, you are my Lord. La ilaha illa ant. Nothing is like unto you. There is one. It is you, subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is no partners in your dominion. خلقتني وأنا عبدك. I have been designed and brought into life. You are my creator, you are my designer. And I testify that in this regard, I am but a humble servant to you. وَأَنَا عَلَى عَهْدِكَ وَوَعْدِكَ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُ. And as I go about in this world, being an individual who acknowledges their relationship with you in that we are humbled servants, my actions, my choices, I attempted and I attempt to fulfill your respects, your rights to the utmost of my ability. Okay? Mastata, to the utmost of my ability. And in this acknowledgement, I know that I have lapsed and made mistakes. أعوذ بك من شر ما صنعت. I seek refuge in you, Almighty, O God, in the evil actions I have chosen to make, in my purposeful mistakes, in my purposeful lapses from that which I have done and committed. أبوء لك بنعمتك علي. I testify openly to the tremendous bounty that you have given me. Even though I've made mistakes, even though I've faulted, you've given me tremendous bounty during that time, during my time now. And all good I have had is from you. Abu'u bidhanbi as well. And I testify openly and declare to the mistakes I have in my ma'asi. فَاغْفِرْ لِي فَإِنَّهُ لَا يَغْفِرُ الذُّنُوبَ إِلَّا أَنْتَ. So as such, as a humble servant to you, acknowledging these things, forgive me, for verily in the end, when it comes to the spiritual forgiveness, that forgiveness only comes, and acceptance of forgiveness only comes as the last word from the Almighty subhanahu wa ta'ala. Man qalaha min al-nahar, he goes on to say, the Prophet ﷺ, he says, whoever says it in the morning, right? Let's say, muqinan biha, oh, in the morning, beginning your day, and you are certain of the things you said, you are sincere in the things you say, famata min yawmihi, and they pass away during that day, during that morning session. And traditionally that would mean from sunrise down towards sunset and or towards Maghrib. قبل أن يمسي فهو من أهل الجنة. If you were to pass during this time frame before the evening lapses, then she is considered from the people of paradise. وَمَنْ قَالَهَا مِنَ اللَّيْلِ وَهُوَ مُوقِنٌ بِهَا. And if a person says that same supplication and they are certain, it is sincere, and they believe in the things they say, and they pass away before morning, فَهُوَ مِنْ أَهْلِ الْجَنَّةِ. Their end destiny with the Almighty and their destination is paradise. The example of this as a form of husn al-dhan billah subhanahu wa ta'ala is manifested in the acknowledgement that there is a relationship, in the acknowledgement that you recognize the infinite mercy of the Almighty, in the acknowledgement that there is always hope, regardless of the difficulty that you face, in the acknowledgement that things that seem very large and heavy on our shoulders, with the Almighty is, and the Almighty's ability foremost demonstrates that it's small when you go through Him subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another example of husn al-dhan in the prophetic traditions is that Abdullah bin Abbas, he had mentioned of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ that he said, قَالَ مَنْ عَادَ مَرِيضًا لَمْ يَحْضُرْ أَجَلُهُ. That if a person visits an individual who is in a state of sickness, and in this state, while they are sick, they are a patient, and that in their sickness, it is not their time to pass, and they go to Him, meaning they are not in the state of passing, and it is not their time, and they go to Him, and they say, فَقَالَ عِنْدَهُ سَبْعَ مَرَّاتٍ, and they say while they are there in their supplications to the Almighty, أَسْأَلَ اللَّهَ الْعَظِيمَ رَبَّ الْعَرْشِ الْعَظِيمَ أَنْ يَشْفِيكَ, that they pray to the Almighty that the Almighty cures the individual at hand, okay, and that the Almighty in this supplication is the one who cures, and that the Almighty is all able and far above that إِلَّا عَافَاهُ اللَّهُ مِنْ ذَلِكَ الْمَرَضِ, except that sooner or later, with this sincere prayer, sooner or later, the Almighty will cure him from that particular sickness. This is demonstrated of the husn al-dhan billah, demonstrating again the ability and positive thoughts of the Almighty that sooner or later, time will swoon and things will be changed, and you will return back to goodness, God willing. If it is not your time to move on, and if it is your time to move on, the end result of what you're going through with a positive thought and a good heart and a return to the Almighty is positivity, inshallah. That's why there's a person in history known as Al-Hajjaj bin Yusuf al-Thaqafi. There were discussions about the choices he made and his Islamic belief and these type of things among scholars throughout history. But an interesting thing is a slight discussion here where Umar ibn Abdul Aziz is mentioned to have said that he was told, Al-Hajjaj bin Yusuf al-Thaqafi, before he passed, he said, "Oh Allah, forgive me, for verily the people say you will not forgive me for my atrocities." And they brought this to some of the scholars of their time, and they said, "It is possible. We don't know. It's in the hands of the Almighty." Okay, but rights will be fulfilled. There's no doubt about that. But we're talking about the concept of mercy with the Almighty in Islamic theology. And this is something that is demonstrating it. The Prophet ﷺ, from his characteristic, which demonstrates the concept of husn al-dhan, is when he would visit someone who is in a state of sickness. It is attributed to him, okay? And this narration it's a good narration, that the Prophet ﷺ, when he would visit the person who is in a state of sickness, one of the things he would say is, "La ba's tahur, insha'Allah ta'ala." That we pray that there is no serious harm to you. Stay patient. No harm, inshallah, by the grace of God. It is a purifier. It is a purification. Especially here, a purification for your spirituality and your spiritual thoughts, especially. So as a result, a purification for the ma'asi we may have made in life, among other things as well. This demonstrates, again, husn al-dhan, because whatever the circumstance, there can always be a positive thought, optimistic thought, whenever you're going through the route of the Almighty. So that's the point. That's the characteristic we're trying to learn from husn al-dhan, that characteristic, that adab with God, when we're afflicted with things, which everyone will be and has been afflicted with things, is to constantly have optimistic thoughts of God and towards God and his names and attributes. This essentially is what's trying to be taught in Islamic theology. And a demonstration of that is a famous narrative of Abraham when he made supplications to God, where he said, وَإِذَا مَرِضْتُ فَهُوَ يَشْفِينِي. He added the connotation that because he has good mannerism with God and optimism and husn al-dhan in God, that when I become sick, God is the Almighty who cures me. He didn't say, when you make me sick, you're the one who cures me. Mannerism with God is demonstrative mannerism. It is also demonstrative optimism, right? Well thoughts and beliefs in God known as husn al-dhan. From the good actions when visiting one who is sick is to place your palm on the forehead or upon the hand to the sick one to show care and love. And when you are there in this circumstance, to ask how are they doing and pray for them. This is in a case where you can do so. And this narration is kind of what has been taught of the mannerisms of the Prophet Muhammad. This particular wording, the chain of transmitters are acceptable. It's layyin. It's not necessarily hasan, but it's still higher than the basic level of weakness. So it is trying to demonstrate the concept of, even as us, when we visit a person who is sick or know of their sickness and we have the chance to speak to them, other than the fact there's good mannerism, but to stay optimistic, even with them. And this is a manifested thought of husn al-dhan, that characteristic, mannerisms with God, husn al-dhan. Demonstrative when you visit someone else as well, to show kindness, to place your hand on their forehead, on their hand, and ask how are they doing, staying optimistic in your prayers for forgiveness upon them. And as a result, an interesting thing is that, for example, quite a famous scholar, I believe many of us know of, Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah ta'ala, he has a statement that it's unacceptable for a person to say that the Almighty will not forgive so-and-so. It's unacceptable as well for a person to say, God will not forgive me. But you should have positive thoughts of God and work towards that nearness to God, subhanahu wa ta'ala. We pray the Almighty forgives our faults and makes things easy for us during this time and for others as well. Remember that Islamic theology, again, is trying to teach us a correct thought and belief in God, and that there's always hope with God. What's important for us is to have optimistic thoughts and beliefs and understandings of God with our limited understanding. This is known as husn al-dhan billah. In this belief of husn al-dhan, you will constantly, God willing, be optimistic, and you will be a beacon of hope and goodness for people, for yourself, for your family, for your community, and for humanity at large. Wallahu waliyu tawfiq subhanahu wa ta'ala. God bless you all. Enjoy your evening. Until we meet again next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.